Welcome back, everybody. It's really good to see you, and I hope you've had a refreshing break and some lunch and a chance to reflect on all you've heard this morning. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Dyas, who is reader in the history of Christianity and director of the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture and the Centre for Pilgrimage Studies at the University of York. And her research interests and publications, which are many, have focused primarily on the history, the experience, and the significance of pilgrimage from the earliest centuries to the present day, and the interaction between Christian belief and practice with Western culture, particularly in relation to literature and art. I've known Dee for a number of years and have long admired her fabulous work on pilgrimage. So it's a great pleasure to have her here with us this afternoon to talk to us. And then there will be an opportunity, as usual, to ask questions over the chat, which Dee will be glad to address. Dee, over to you. Thank you and welcome.
Hello, I'm Dee Dyas from the Centre for the Study of Christianity at the University of York. I'm also director of the Centre for Pilgrimage Studies, which may be why I was asked to speak about theology ambushed by experience and whether this is an appropriate way of looking at pilgrimage today. I'd like to start by using some words from Alice Through the Looking Glass. Written by Charles Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll, a man who spent much of his life at Christchurch, the virtual home for this conference. When I use the word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. And Alice's rather blunt challenge ought to make those of us who think about, talk about, and practice pilgrimage sit up and take notice, especially when thinking about pilgrimage in a Christian context. Because today, pilgrimage is definitely one of those words that can mean a multitude of things. A few days ago, I did a search in the US Library of Congress catalogue and came up with 4,704 titles containing the word pilgrimage. These include an Australian wine pilgrimage, a bowling pilgrimage, a patchwork pilgrimage, that's about quilting in case you were wondering, a pilgrimage by foot and greyhound bus to Tolkien's Middle-earth, and even a flying saucer pilgrimage. These wildly varying uses of the word show its great flexibility. They also show that very flexibility means that anyone who has a fancy to do so can adopt it and Humpty Dumpty-like make it mean whatever they want. Just using the word today is enough to invest almost any kind of journey with significance. Does it matter? Well, no and yes. No, in that the intuitive understanding by people in general that pilgrimage somehow means a special journey to a special place with a special meaning is undoubtedly very important. Journeying to special places is a concept and practice familiar to those of almost every religion and meaningful to many who don't subscribe to any formal religious system. It's therefore a great unifier and almost uniquely a religious term that doesn't frighten people. That's one reason why churches, especially cathedrals, have been using it a great deal over the last few years to draw in visitors. However, the flip side is that pilgrimage is now used so widely that sometimes it's hard to know what it actually means. This isn't helped by the fact that pilgrimage has had a rather checkered past in Christian thinking and experience, with many ways of interpreting its meaning even within this one faith. And there have been huge challenges in holding together its practical manifestations. But pilgrimage within Christianity is not a single concept, but a mosaic of ideas and experiences that have evolved through the centuries. Sometimes these are combined reasonably well. Sometimes they've conflicted. One of the biggest confrontations was at the Reformation, but this was by no means the first or the last chapter in this story. As a result, there are many kinds of pilgrims, many kinds of pilgrimage, each with something particular to offer. Some emphasize the benefits of the journey. Some with of emphasis on fellowship, being with people, the space that it offers to rebuild and refocus on what's important to us. And I think the effect of, as this last quote says here, the effect of the way that pilgrimage changes people and makes them more open, more able to engage with life in general. Some also focus on the joys of arrival, while others feel the only way to progress spiritually is to stay still physically. But at the heart of all of these ways of being a pilgrim, of doing pilgrimage, is the fact they're centered on learning about God, meeting him, and being changed by him. Pilgrimage, whichever way we look at it in a Christian context, is about revelation, encounter with God, and transformation. So the question for us today is, how can we understand the range of riches available to us, maximize their potential, and share them with others? Let me give you some snapshots through time of people and places that show what I mean. I'm going to start with the surprisingly wide range of pilgrim experience in the Bible. If we look at the Bible through a pilgrim lens, we find widely differing models, framing experience of God in contrasting ways. In the Old Testament, I'm calling it that rather than Hebrew Bible because we're talking here about Christian interpretation, we see two main approaches to pilgrim engagement with God: journeying with him and journeying to him. I must confess here that as having trained as a medievalist, I do have a tendency to use quite a lot of medieval images. I hope you enjoy them. Journeying with God is seen here in the life of Abraham, who was instructed to leave his home in search of the place to which God was calling him, and learned to sacrifice short-term benefits for long-term rewards. Abraham's progress was a little unsteady, but he stuck with it, and that's why the Celtic monks who helped bring Christianity to England via Iona and Northumbria saw him as a prototype pilgrim and a key role model for their own faith journeys with God. Similarly, God is shown leading Moses and the Israelites through the wilderness to the land of Canaan. His presence especially symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant, which you can see in this drawing on the right, housed in the tabernacle, a splendid but portable place of worship. There was also the model of journeying to God. Once they settled in the land and Jerusalem had been captured, the temple which Solomon built there came to be seen as the place for special encounters with God and the focus of the great annual pilgrimages of Judaism. The temple, and this is a model which shows the glory of all the gold that was used, was like the tabernacle before it, was very carefully constructed, furnished with superlative craftsmanship and immensely costly materials, which together created a multi-sensory, immersive experience of glory and splendor, which still influences our experience of pilgrimage today. The temple is depicted as being filled with abundant color, texture, fragrance, and sound. Priests were clad in very costly crimson, blue, purple, and gold vestments. Bronze, silver, and gold fittings reflected the light cast by lampstands. The air was full of fragrance of myrrh, cinnamon, and incense, and with sounds of praise. The sensory impact was maximized as people and priests moved through the spaces, made offerings, prayed, fell on their faces in awe. Sensory experience and generation of emotion are key to both tabernacle and temple, as they will continue to be throughout the story of pilgrimage. Human beings can only learn and understand and respond through their senses, which neuroscientists now think can number as many as 30, including the senses of movement. Emotions now also recognized as a key element in the creation of long-term memory and in decision-making and change. The Psalms, which became the heartbeat of Christian worship in the West, have at their core this combination of emotion, memory, and encounter with God, enhanced to a really carefully constructed communication of holiness. The temple and Jerusalem as a whole came to be seen as a place where God had chosen to dwell, where he could be approached for forgiveness and other blessings in a special way. And the way the temple is described and used echoes those three elements of pilgrimage: revelation, encounter, and transformation. Revelation, teaching the power and character of God through what is seen and done. communicating a sense of God's presence and the possibility of encountering him through the use of beauty, precious metals and jewels, and signaling through these sensory stimuli his holiness and evoking emotion, creating a sense of his power to encourage the fact and the belief that he can change people and groups. Both the tabernacle and the temple have left their mark on every Christian aim of creating special places for encounter with God. In the New Testament, however, we see a really different emphasis, also very important today. Jerusalem and the temple do feature in the Gospels, but there's a major shift. God's now present in a human being, can be seen, touched, heard, and brings transformation. He is the revelation of God. So New Testament writers see the temple as obsolete because God is now available to everybody, first in the person of Jesus and then through the Holy Spirit. So who needs special places? This view was reinforced by the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans and the expulsion of most Christians and Jews from the city. And for the first 3 centuries of the church, the main meaning of the term pilgrim therefore became that of a Christian believer, travelling towards life, towards the heavenly city of Jerusalem, described in the book of Revelation. It's a place of amazing beauty, lit by the very presence of God. Pearls, gold, glory, light, Jesus at the centre. And as a result, New Testament writers address all Christians, all believers, as strangers and pilgrims, asking them not to sin, and also encouraging them that those figures of the Old Testament confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. They too were on the way to a heavenly country. It's vital to note, though, that labelling Christians as strangers and pilgrims who are also citizens of heaven is in no way an excuse to avoid commitment to this world. In fact, anything but. God's people are to serve and care, but with an underlying level of security and a set of external values, which means they can be radical and fearless in so doing, because they don't have all their eggs in this particular earthly basket, so they can stand up for what they believe is right, take risks, even if it costs them in the present. And this is woven through the early fathers of the church, such as Augustine, who defined Christian life as a pilgrimage towards heaven. For the first 3 centuries after Christ, there is no evidence that Christians venerated sites as holy or as places of special devotional experience. But of course, things didn't stay that way. The pendulum was about to swing in the opposite direction. In the 4th century came the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, whose pagan background meant he expected to have holy places and to mark them with splendid buildings. Constantine and his mother Helena therefore reinvented Palestine as a Christian holy land, creating great churches in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which, conscious of Solomon's example, they filled with gold, silver, jewels, light and colour. Once again, beauty and the extravagant use of precious materials were used to create a sense of holiness and God's presence. Once again, we have the revelation of God's power and encouragement that he can be known in ways that will change lives. Bishop Cyril introduced immensely powerful liturgies and promoted the uniqueness of Jerusalem with superb salesmanship. Others only hear, he proclaimed, but we see and touch. He devised liturgies which employed multiple senses and acts of devotion, including kissing the relic of the cross. People were encouraged to enact biblical scenes in situ and pray and worship in ways that triggered emotion and created powerful memories. Jerusalem was not only a place in which it was made holy by past events, it became the setting where God could be encountered in the present. Egeria, a nun from Spain, visiting the land of the Bible in the late 4th century, describes a multi-layered, multi-sensory intensification of Christian experience in which profound emotion was triggered by recollecting together an event in the life of Christ at the very spot where it was believed to have taken place. When everyone arrives at Gethsemane, they have an appropriate prayer, a hymn, then a reading from the Gospel about the Lord's arrest. By the time it has been read, everyone is groaning and lamenting and weeping so loud that people across the city can probably hear. But how did this heady mix fit with earlier teaching? Significant voices raised concern. Gregory of Nyssa, most of the time, and Jerome, some of the time, insisted the pilgrimage to special places was unnecessary and even spiritually dangerous. And these developments did pose an inescapable theological conundrum. If some places were considered especially holy, then logically other places must be less so. And could it really be claimed that an omnipresent God was somehow more accessible in Jerusalem than in Britain? Jerome and Gregory, wearing their theological hats, both said no. On the other hand, Gregory himself shed tears when visiting Jerusalem, and Jerome was no stranger to intense sensory, emotion-packed devotional experiences in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. These otherwise stern fathers of the church are clear illustrations of the fact that when theology is ambushed by experience tends to win out. But why? Quite simply, it's a factor of the way that human beings work. I spent a good many years examining the aspects of human physiology and psychology, which make us hardwired to find meaning in and attach meaning to places, and the importance of the senses in spiritual learning and response. These fundamental aspects of human nature provide one of the key reasons why pilgrimages prove so hard to suppress when people have tried to do so. This model of encounter with God, so carefully constructed in Jerusalem, not only became very powerful within the Holy Land, but spread across Christendom through the reconstruction of buildings which created the same kind of sensory experience. Even in the early days of the church in Anglo-Saxon England, we see deliberate imitation of the sensory splendours of the tabernacle and the temple, as kings and bishops used precious metals and jewels and employed superb craftsmen to evoke the powerful sense of God's presence and holiness. During these early centuries, however, yet another form of pilgrimage emerged, as monasticism developed in the deserts of Egypt and Palestine. The desert fathers and mothers renounced homes and families for a life of prayer, accepting exile on earth to win citizenship in heaven. From the start, this way of life was seen as a specialized kind of pilgrimage, in which inner journeying could only be achieved by staying still. As a result of these developments, there existed from the 4th century onwards 4 main elements within Christian pilgrimage. One overarching concept, life as pilgrimage towards the heavenly Jerusalem, and 3 main strands of practical outworking. Interior pilgrimage, which includes monasticism and prayer and contemplation and the mystical life, and seeking God in an inner Jerusalem. Moral pilgrimage, which is the calling of every Christian to follow their calling, to be obedient, to care for the community and serve those around them. And place pilgrimage, involving journeying to saint shrines or other places to gain forgiveness, healing, or other material benefits, and to express devotion. That's very much about being mobile, leaving one's daily responsibilities in place of work, at least for a time. Clearly, there was quite a lot of room for these elements both to combine and to conflict. It's hard to be stable and mobile at the same time. And those who stressed inner pilgrimage were keenly aware of this. For them, there were 3 Jerusalems: the earthly city, the ultimate pilgrim destination, the heavenly city, the eventual goal of all Christians, and an interior Jerusalem. There aren't many people in the Middle Ages who tried to pursue all 3. One who stands out was Marjorie Kemp, the controversial merchant's wife who travelled widely in the 15th century. Although she was much criticised, she did try to let her pilgrimage to places resource both her inner life with God and her daily life. So what did place pilgrimage offer in the Middle Ages? Ideally, though not always, it was designed to strengthen a person's daily relationship with God, so it has to be said that some returned home needing more forgiveness than when they set off. Walking wasn't really a treat for the average medieval person, so unless you were doing specific penance, you would have ridden if you could, as these pilgrims are shown doing. But the journey to a shrine would have offered most people a rare break from work and the chance to explore the world. The emphasis was for them, though, was on what happened when they reached the goal and how it might change their lives. Our centre at York uses archaeological and archival evidence to create digital reconstruction of medieval shrines, so we can get a better idea of what it felt like to be a medieval pilgrim. Like the tabernacle and the temple, these were places carefully designed to strengthen belief and encourage response. Places and objects have through the centuries played a major role in confirming Christian doctrine, whether being in Jerusalem or Oxford, seeing a fragment of the true cross or kissing the relics of the saint. These all help make the stories of the Bible and saints' lives more concrete. At Canterbury in 1322, a visiting friar described the body of Thomas Becket as resting in a case made of most pure gold and adorned with innumerable precious stones with shining pearls like unto the gates of the heavenly Jerusalem and sparkling gems. And this reconstruction shows pilgrims, real life stories of pilgrims, coming to the shrine to give thanks, to pray, and seeing the splendor made them realize that this was truly a place where heaven and earth intersect. Seeing was definitely believing. Nor were the other senses excluded. Bells rang, choirs sang music fit for heaven, tombs might exude healing oil or sweet smells, and above everything, the pilgrims were moving, touching, crawling within sacred spaces, touching and being touched by them, literally and metaphorically. They might even drink or eat fragments of stone, dust, healing oil. All the senses were thus at work together, and the offerings around shrines. There are grills all around the shrine, which helps create a sense of anticipation as you approach it. That's one of our findings. But on them are hung offerings which people have left, a nightgown from a woman who has prayed for a child and received one, crutches from those who've been healed. All of these objects help create faith, so the shrine was framed by answered prayer and encouragement to all who came. Though powerful in terms of experience, medieval pilgrimage also had its weaknesses. For some, it was a substitute for daily closeness to God rather than aid to it, and failed to feed back into everyday life. As such, it was very vulnerable to the criticisms which came to the fore at the Reformation, when pilgrimage and associated practices became a major battleground, and much of pilgrimage infrastructure was dismantled along with monasteries. Despite much resistance, many buildings lost a lot of their light and colour and beauty and splendour, and pilgrim journeys were actively suppressed. The reformers were determined to shine a fresh light on salvation by faith rather than by attempted good works, such as pilgrim journeys. Protestant teaching refocused on the New Testament pilgrimage as a journey through life, which is most famously illustrated in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And yet, as we saw earlier, it isn't that easy to suppress pilgrimage to places. And we get glimpses of good Protestant Englishmen travelling abroad, finding themselves, despite their theological convictions, being caught up in intensely emotional devotional responses to pilgrimage sites. In 1611, the son of the Archbishop of York, an outspoken critic of pilgrimage, unlike the present one, wrote of his visit to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Thousands of Christians perform their vows, offer their tears yearly, with all the expressions of sorrow, humility, affection, and penitence. It's a frozen zeal which would not be warmed by the sight thereof. Oh, that I could retain the effects it wrought. There were many other firm Protestants who found themselves ambushed by the power of special places in succeeding centuries. One of my favourites is Robert Curzon, who arrived in Jerusalem in 1834. He wrote, "It was curious to observe the different effect which our approach to Jerusalem had upon the various persons who composed our party. A Christian pilgrim fell down on his knees, kissed the holy ground. 2 others embraced each other. As for us, we sat bolt upright on our horses and stared and said nothing. Whilst around us, the more natural children of the East wept for joy, we who consider ourselves civilized and superior beings repressed our emotions. I would have got off my horse and walked barefoot to the gate, as some did if I had dared. At last, I blew my nose, and rode slowly on. Clearly, he was overcome by emotion, but couldn't let it out. However, before much longer, Thomas Cook would both found modern tourism and revive pilgrimage to the Holy Land almost single-handedly, opening the way to secular and spiritual travel for millions. And pilgrimage, as we know, has continued to grow throughout the 20th century to the present day. So what does this whistle-stop tour of pilgrimage have to say to us today? These are the elements which formed together pilgrim experience, particularly to places, but not only to places. The pilgrim connection with God, revelation, encounter, transformation. Are there ways of drawing together the various strands of pilgrim experience which were torn apart at the Reformation and allowing them to resource one another? As cathedrals and other pilgrimage destinations in this country revive or reinvent themselves to the pleasure of some and the horror of others, how can we evolve a theology of pilgrimage and place which works for us today? A few suggestions as I come to a close. You may have noticed that I have deliberately avoided the label holy places in talking about Christian pilgrimage today. That's because the term lies at the heart of the theological problem facing a faith which emphasizes the omnipresence and therefore the omni-availability of God. People have fought and died over this one. To label particular places as holy can imply that they are qualitatively different from the rest of this world, and that God is somehow more present or more accessible there. This clearly cannot be the case if we worship an omnipresent God, and has led to all kinds of theological battles in the past. Yet many people, including a large number who don't have any formal religious belief, still find such places very helpful and a helpful way into exploring spirituality and enriching their lives. That's not an accident, because that is in fact what these places are for, to make us pause, reflect, and respond. These are the words of someone who came to Canterbury Cathedral as a visitor and left feeling that he had been turned into a pilgrim by his experience of the place. And social scientists and neuroscientists and architects are spending a lot of time thinking about the power of awe, its effect on people, and the way that architecture, the way that buildings, as they did in the Middle Ages, as they still do today, can actually work on us and change us through the physical experience of exploring them. Buildings, such as this beautiful shot of the crypt at Rochester, show that they can evoke in us, whether we come as tourists or as pilgrims or as worshippers, emotion or awareness of beauty, peace and holiness, or something beyond ourselves. And in the research project I did for 3 years, people of all kinds, visitors of all kinds, said that they had almost a physical response, which turned into an emotional and often spiritual response to a place which they sensed had become special through time. So instead of thinking of places as bone of contention, I think it's more useful to see them, as the tabernacle and temple clearly were, as places with a special role, essentially designed to communicate the holiness of God, to make us stop and pay attention, and create sensory experiences which draw us body, mind, and spirit into a deeper understanding of the greatness, glory, and goodness of God and his desire for relationship with us. The difference between these places and others, therefore, lies not in their essence, but in their purpose. They harness human creativity to point to the glory and creativity of God and hint at what it's like to experience his presence. And in this, they are no different to the wonders of creation that we experience when walking through a peaceful landscape, enjoying a world which is also designed, according to the Psalms, to show us God's glory and power and the beauty of his handiwork. So 2 deceptively simple questions remain unresolved. What exactly do we mean by pilgrimage, and who qualifies to be called a pilgrim? After working on the theology, history and practice of pilgrimage for almost 25 years, I've concluded that it is unhelpful to have too narrow or too wide a definition. Sometimes there's an assumption that only those who walk to a distant destination with rucksack and hiking boots can be called pilgrims, whereas in previous centuries, much of the emphasis was on the encounter with God, which waited at the goal, and many pilgrims were in fact locals. On the other hand, pilgrim can be something of a catch-all used to describe people who respond to sites in a manner satisfactory to those who manage them. In a meeting of cathedral deans in the 1990s, the limitations of this approach were admitted with the joke, "I am a pilgrim, you are a visitor, he is a tourist." Trying to separate tourists and pilgrims fails to take into account the vital truth that any one person may experience a wide range of responses, sometimes unexpected, during a journey or while visiting a special place. From my own research and from years of seeking to help cathedrals engage with visitors, I want to suggest a definition of pilgrim experience, which I think can work for both past and present. It is a state of openness to spiritual engagement through place and journey, whether planned or spontaneous, limited neither by mode of transport or the distance travelled. This encompasses those who travel with clear intent and those who may find themselves unexpectedly ambushed by and responsive to the power of place. If a pilgrim is a spiritually responsive person, then everyone is a potential pilgrim in whatever way they choose to pursue. One of our team sayings is, scratch a pilgrim and you may find a tourist. Scratch a tourist and you may well find a pilgrim in the making. So to come back to my title, does the story of Christian pilgrimage demonstrate theology ambushed by experience? Yes, but in a good way. I want to suggest that increased understanding of the power of that experience can actually enrich our theology, because it tells us more about how human beings have been designed to function and respond. I suggest there is room within a wider theology of an omnipresent, available God for special places, created to tell us more about him and encourage us to pause and ask, where have I come from? Where am I now? And where am I going? We are fortunate to have many ways of being a pilgrim today, and some of them are scattered across this image. What unites them is the words at the centre, the core concepts of revelation, encounter, and transformation. And what frames them is the theme of life as a journey towards heaven, because it offers an ongoing story into which all our ways of being pilgrims can be woven as we seek renewal and refreshment for ourselves and encourage others to do the same.
Thank you very much to Dee for that. That was really excellent. I've just got to see if I get myself the right way up. I can. That's excellent. All good. Dee, we've got a number of questions coming in already in comments, but can I just begin by asking you quite a personal question, really. What started your journey and your pilgrimage into this whole area of pilgrimage? How is it that you came across this as a research area at all?
Well, I started a long time ago, actually before I properly went into academic life, working on a book on the Christian background of English literature. And when I'd finished that, because I was a clergy wife, I had children, I couldn't properly go into academic life at that point, I was asked if I'd like to embark on a PhD. And somebody said, what do you want to study? And without even thinking, I said pilgrimage, because the one image which I kept coming up against, worked out in so many different ways, particularly in medieval spirituality, was pilgrimage. But nobody ever seemed to step back and looked at what it actually meant, or the different ways it could be interpreted. It was as if it was so omnipresent, nobody had actually noticed it. So that's what started the journey back in the early 1990s. So quite a long time ago. And I seem to have been involved in it ever since in different ways.
Thank you. And I wonder if I can just tempt you into something that's a different dimension, really. I mean, I would say pilgrimage is pretty common to all the world's faiths, I think, with the possible exception of Judaism. But even there are pilgrimage elements. If someone was putting you on the spot, I mean, just pretend for a moment I'm an undergraduate at the University of York. What do you think it is that unites pilgrims of every faith, spiritually and humanly?
I think the idea that our lives are a journey overall is something that's obviously just resonates with people, and resonates with people who don't have any particular formal religious affiliation at all. I think the work I've been doing over the last few years, I've just published an enormous book on this subject, is looking at why it is that we seem to be hardwired as human beings, both psychologically and physiologically, that we do respond to, as people have been talking about today, to the experience of movement, that it does something to us, to our minds, our spirits, but also that as we arrive at places which I think have been designed to make us feel a revelation of God's character, frame some sort of encounter with him, and enable us to go away with some sort of transformative experience. I think that we are, it just seems to be a universal, that people feel that places should have meaning. They like to discover meaning in places, and we also like to create our own meaning and map those onto places. And one of the things that fascinated me when I was doing my theological training, I cunningly managed to turn most of my essays and dissertations to the subject of pilgrimage in one form or another. And I was really intrigued by what was happening then, this is some 20 years ago, as the whole idea of place, of creating, as we see very often now, mini shrines. If somebody dies tragically, the automatic response now, the expected response, is that we create a small shrine to mark the place, or mark a place associated with that person. And I was really intrigued as to what was driving this. Much of the form of this goes back to Christian practice of the past, but what's driving it is a sense of need today. And so I began to look backwards and forwards, right back to the start of Christian pilgrimage, but also trying to see how this worked out today and why it is. And I've spent the last 5 years working particularly with cathedrals in this country, talking to visitors of all kinds, talking to staff, to volunteers, saying, what's happening? Why is this happening? What are people feeling? What are they seeking? And what are they feeling they're taking away that matters to them? Why are they choosing Christian places to go and visit, even if they don't have any Christian background? They may be from Muslim faith, they may be from, in their own minds, no faith at all. So I don't actually think people don't have any faith at all. I think we all have convictions and beliefs. But somehow this sense of place, meaning, encounter, possible transformation is something that just resonates with everybody. And I think it's a really important thing for the Christian church to explore more, which is why I've been trying to work on ways of looking at it that unite us in seeing the potential and the opportunity, rather than going back to the previous divisions that we've had.
Thank you very much. So we've got some questions coming in, and there are 2 or 3 comments as well, which I want to see if I can just sort of gather these together in a single question. But it just links, in fact, to what you were saying a moment ago about what we might term roadside shrines, you know, when somebody's tragically killed in some kind of motor accident of some sort. What you then find instantly almost is springing up flowers, messages, maybe candles, quite often a cross and so forth. I'm very struck, I think, as a number of other sociologists are, like Grace Davey and Edward Bailey and others, really about the sense in which the marking of these places and then the subsequent visits to them by those grieving or those who have a particular affinity for the deceased, take on the character of something that is spiritual and religious, which is actually beyond the control of the church. And when one thinks about the origins of some shrines, of course, one of the things that was most difficult, I think, certainly for medieval Christianity, was some bishops simply couldn't control the proliferation of shrines. And if they couldn't control it, they couldn't tax it. Some of them did actually have theological objections. They thought it was superstitious nonsense, effectively the equivalent, as I was saying earlier, of a sort of, kind of divine dating sort of thing, that, shrines to love and particular saints were little more than meeting places for divining, who you might end up with eventually. But underneath that, there's something very rich and powerful, isn't there, about humanity perceiving that there is divinity abroad, quite independent of the control of the church. And a journey and a shrine somehow seems like something that on the one hand is more significant and yet at the same time requires less life commitment, which is not to say pilgrims aren't giving life commitment. But, if you look at Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, not everybody on those Canterbury Tales is what I might call a lifelong committed, paid up disciple who's been on an alpha course and is committed to supporting their parish through direct debit. Some of them are kind of on for the ride, aren't they, really? But it doesn't mean that something extraordinary doesn't happen to them and that God meets them in that journey. I just wondered if you could comment on the general effervescence of pilgrimage today.
Yes, I mean, just to go back to Chaucer quickly, that being some of my home territory, it is interesting that, as you say, the pilgrims are a very motley crew, but we tend to, and some of them have definitely other reasons for travelling. The wife of Bath is apparently on the hunt for a fifth husband, rather than any major spiritual experience. But it is also interesting that one of the parts of the Canterbury Tales nobody much reads is the Parson's Tale, which begins with the parson, who is one of the few signed up and clearly spiritual people on the journey, saying, "Let me show you the way in this journey to the heavenly, the voyage to the heavenly Jerusalem." So it's very interesting. It sort of pops up there, but because it's a prose text and it's not as much fun as the rest, sometimes it gets ignored. But I think that having had the privilege of working with Grace Davey for a number of years now on various projects and other sociologists, social anthropologists, I've been learning a great deal about this. I think it's been very interesting for working together as historians, theologians, and social scientists to really try and tease out what it is that people are seeking and needing. And I think one of the big things is that we may be maybe we're in a post-Christian society now. I don't quite know where we've got up to on this, but I think people still need ritual to frame their lives. They still need meaning. And if people don't have or don't use the ritual that's been handed down, then they start inventing their own. And actually, it very often mimics what's been there in the past. But it is really important that people have that. And I think we've seen a really good example of that with what I think is one of the worst effects of COVID, in that we haven't been able to have proper funerals and grieving processes. And this is an occasion where very often people who don't normally go to church do actually have the benefit of funerals taken by ministers and others, and just a way of coming together, of remembering a life, of marking it. And I think, again, baptisms, weddings were suspended for a while. And I've heard of a lot of people, I'm currently running a survey about the effect of COVID on the community in general. People are really missing that. It's something we take for granted when it's there, and we've lost it. There is a certain element of pain there, because our lives need that. Our lives are a journey, but we don't want it to be just a vague drifting. We need to be able to mark the things that are important to us. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. No, that's great. That's right. So I'm going to pick up another couple of questions here. One is, we've just seen the recent reconnection between Chartwell and Churchill, which is basically a property that is part of the Churchill family. I wonder if you could say, what do you think is the difference between a visit to Chartwell and a visit to a cathedral?
Well, as I started with, a pilgrimage in the sense of being a special journey to learn about things and to have an experience, is a word that's really worked quite hard these days. And I think a lot of people would say people go on pilgrimage to Graceland to commemorate Elvis Presley. And actually, if you see the pictures of those, you actually light candles and have framed photographs of him. Now, I don't think, I haven't seen really Untitled Chapter. I doubt whether we've got candles in front of a picture of Winston Churchill. But I think there is a sense of rediscovering and remembering in a kind of secular way what's important to us. And Churchill obviously symbolizes many, many things to this country still. And I think, I would brand that as a secular pilgrimage, but I think that there is a sense in which we can allow the word pilgrimage to have that special meaning. I think our problem when we're discussing Christian pilgrimage is that we need to have other elements to it. And I noticed somebody's asked what my 3 key words were. They are revelation, encounter, and transformation. And I'm sure that visiting Chartwell will have a transformative effect, but it won't have quite the same one as visiting a Christian holy place with certain attitudes and openness.
Thanks very much. I'm very conscious of that extraordinary American sociologist, Cressida Creasy-Dean, who talks about Generation Zers and how, their view of religion and God is quite different now to perhaps what was around in the 1950s and 60s. And she says if you're trying to characterize a view of God today amongst perhaps sixth formers and undergraduates and beyond, thinking perhaps of my own sons here as well, she says God is, or religion is viewed as an African farm. It has no fence. And the only question is how far away from you are you from the farmhouse? And are you journeying towards it or away from it? So again, you've got that journeying motif in there. And there's that sense in the world today of pilgrimage being an invitation to almost amble through religious traditions. I know when I taught in a different university, I'd often start a course of lectures in one particular subject with how many people in the room would say that they were religious, and out of, say, 100 attendees, maybe 5 or 7 rather reticent people would half put their hands up, in that kind of rather Anglican way, not going to fully put their hands up, but, half of it. But if you ask the question, how many of you are spiritual, it was very rare to have less than 85% of the room raise their hands. And then that was the rest of the lecture. What do you mean by spirituality? And for them, it was anything from music by Enya to enchant to a sacred stone that they'd picked up by the shores of Iona, a candle that they'd taken from Thésée. It could almost be anything, really. But these were always incredibly moving conversations. And they saw themselves as people who were quite at home in pilgrimage, actually. Saw no difficulty with that at all. What they didn't want to do was opt into religion, but pilgrimage gave them permission to be spiritual.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. Again, going back to the major research project I've been working on and some of the outcomes of that, I think the biggest message that we wanted to give to cathedrals as a whole was, please don't categorize your visitors as they come in. Do not assume you know what's behind that exterior. You don't know the needs that are there. I've spent a lot of time reading carefully anonymized prayers that are left as they are now in their hundreds and thousands at even Anglican cathedrals now, and the sort of the scale of human need that's under them. And I think in the past, people have tended to think, well, you go to somewhere like a cathedral as a visitor, you're a heritage person, or you go as a worshipper, or you go as a pilgrim. And as I say, the biggest message we want to get across was, it's a person. It's not any one of those things. It's a person. And what we found was, as we had many, many conversations with people, and as we observed them carefully and sort of discreetly, was that anybody could find themselves shocked into a spiritual response. by being in a particular situation. And again, one of my favorite story is one of the guides, stewards at Durham, said she found a man walking down the central aisle of the cathedral in tears, saying, "I don't know what this place is doing to me. I'm a secular person. I don't do this. And yet this place is getting to me." And I think that's tapping into that innate sense of the spiritual, which I think is part of the way we're created. So we may frame it in different ways, but it's there. And therefore, I think, the ability to respond and the ability sometimes to surprise ourselves, or just feeling ourselves in a place which gives us space, gives us quiet, gives us safety. There aren't many places where you can stop and just be in a safe way in this world at the moment. And that's one of the losses of not having had churches and cathedrals open for a while during COVID, because historically that's where people go in time of emergency. And I've had a lot of people coming back to me and saying, "I've so missed this. I don't normally go to church, but in a time like this, I would, because it's beautiful, it's peaceful, it gives me what I need, and I can stop and look at my life, I can get some perspective, and I can find the hope and comfort to move on." And I would want to say, I think you're absolutely right. I think most people would describe themselves as spiritual. Most people don't like the word religious or religion because they think it's formal, it's about rules, it's about containing something that they want to be free. But that doesn't mean that people don't in fact want to explore spiritually. They want to find out what works for them, what will help them. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't see the idea of being a pilgrim as a way into offering something to people to explore in the way they want to, but with a very open-ended agenda in which they can find whatever they need. And I found, again, a lot of people welcoming people to cathedrals were saying, "Oh, we're not actually even inviting people to worship." I've actually had colleagues and research students and others turned away from cathedral doors, or attempted to be, because they'd go and say, "I've come for the service," and I've had it explained in very simple words. No, it's a service, because they were under 30. So why would they want to come to a service? And they always had to fight their way in. And actually many young people, as we know from work that's going on, places like the British Pilgrimage Trust, absolutely love and respond to evensong, other beautiful music. So we need to be careful that we are not on the inside of the church, actually trapped in our own boundaries and our own sort of frameworks. And we need to realize that freedom outside is something that people actually might want. We might be the ones shutting the doors, or actually not welcoming them in to explore whatever pilgrimage can mean to them.
Thank you for that. And there's another question I want to raise in a moment, which is to do with people coming in and being treated and respected and welcomed, but not in an overwhelming way, simply because they're precious to God and loved by God, as we all are equally. So one of the questions picks up on this in terms of funerals and the kind of correlation between what's being offered in a pilgrimage and what might be offered in the pastoral offices like baptisms, weddings and funerals. But it strikes me as somebody who happens to live next door to a cathedral, that if I go out in my civvies and I just watch people entering in to Christ Church Cathedral, I would say, irrespective of their age, nationality, background, faith or none, religion or none, the minute people step inside, their body language and behaviour changes. They go quieter, they tread softer, they walk slower, they gaze differently. And I observe a quite different body language to what, for example, they might do if they go into the Great Hall of Christ Church, where they're expecting, a very grand Tudor dining hall, and quite a number of them are expecting to be able to take photographs of the model for Hogwarts dining hall as well. But the interesting thing about the religious space is that, of course, it's saying something and doing something that's outside my control and your control, I can't tell people what this space is doing to them, and I can't tell people what a shrine will do to them. And one of the funny things it seems to me about the Reformation is that elements of the church regained control over meaning, and they could direct that, and they could do it through belief and speech. But when you start to trust the aesthetics, the journey, the space, the art, the beauty, the atmosphere, you can't control how that impacts people. And that's why your example is so beautiful. Somebody walks into a cathedral and, of course, they're overwhelmed. It's nothing I've done or you've done. There's no sign up at the beginning, is there, that says, you're entering a space, be prepared to be overwhelmed, because that would be silly. In a sense, the space does the work, the journey does the work, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons I find it so fascinating to look at how, from the beginning, in terms of tabernacle, temple, this is, you and I haven't done it, but it has been done. It has been deliberately created in that kind of way. And I mean, there is a neuroscientist was saying that when you actually walk into a medieval cathedral and you look up, that actually does something to your brain and creates a sense of euphoria. And you have to look up because it's so beautiful. It's been created so that it makes you look up to the ceiling, up to the vaulting, etc. And to find yourself in this space, somehow held in this space, and yet overwhelmed by it. It's awe-inspiring. It's meant to be awe-inspiring. That's what I mean about, the job of these places is to do just that. It is to make you think about God and respond. And it's intuitive. It's instinctive. It's not something, as you say, you can warn people before they walk in, but actually it will act upon people because that's what it's meant to do. And I think that is something that it also works in small churches. Again, it's the beauty, it's the space, it's the peace. And I think these are things that we often crave as human beings, even if we don't know we do.
Yeah.
And you may not be used to it. And sometimes if you're not used to it, it can be quite scary. But I think we need to look at more about how we both keep that wow factor, but also allow people ways to engage in a sensory way, in a more controlled and confined, sort of a safer way. Because in a medieval cathedral, like yours, like many others, before the Reformation, it would have been full of small spaces, smaller altars, focal points, where people could have their own little space. Now they are beautiful, but they're quite vast and they're sometimes quite overwhelming. And we need to find ways of saying, here's a beautiful little chapel, come and sit in there, and you can feel safe and protected, and you can just be. And we need to open up our spaces in new ways, give people things to look at, which will communicate, even if they don't have Christian vocabulary, and why should they? All kinds of ways, give them things to do. Because again, a lot of the work I've been doing is so much about how we need to learn by doing things. One of the outcomes of one of our projects was we held a day at Canterbury Cathedral, a sensory experience day. And we got people to do a number of things. But one of them, I think probably the most powerful, was we said medieval pilgrims used to come seeking forgiveness. Here are some post-it notes. Write on them things you're sorry for. Put them in a bowl of water. And they were written in special ink. So the words just disappeared. And people were coming back to do it again and saying, wow, that is so cathartic. And people were doing it from 7-year-olds to 90-year-olds. And we said, well, actually, that's kind of the message that God can wipe away sin, wash away sin, literally. And they even wanted to take home the blank piece of paper, even though it was somewhat soggy from the water. But it was a way of allowing them to act out something which didn't actually mean a lot in theory, but once they actually acted it out, suddenly came to have real resonance. And I think a lot of medieval pilgrimage was about that. It had a lot for you to do. And going back to the question of the souvenirs, the pilgrim tokens and the tat question this morning, I think that's something that's still very powerful, that those things in earlier centuries encapsulated the experience and resourced the memory once you got home. And very interestingly, again, we found that Canterbury Cathedral has a shop inside and a big, very splendid shop outside. And people actually said to us, it means more if I buy it inside the cathedral, even if it's the same thing, than it does when I buy it outside. And that's because it absolutely is then associated with the place. And somehow it takes you back to being in the place. And therefore, when you take it home, you share it with other people, you go back to it, then it has that meaning. It takes you to where you were and what you experienced at the time.
Thank you to you very much. That's a wonderful note on which to end. I remember somebody asked me a couple of years ago, what was it that in the cathedral that spoke about God, that moved people so much? And I said, well, it's the space as a whole, and the way it speaks about God is this: it's just too much to take in. And when you proceed into a building like that, you suddenly realize that actually the problem we've had for 2,000 years is coping with the overwhelming abundance of God. Too much to take in. But a pilgrimage allows you to walk at a gentle pace around that and realize it's a lifetime and more. Dee, thanks hugely for everything. This has been a rich and stimulating time, and God bless you in your work. And this also gives me an opportunity to say to all those watching that this is the last shout for the festival bookshop. There's free postage today on a set of specially selected titles on pilgrimage and travel. And don't forget, we'll be back at 3:15 for our open forum discussion with Sally Welsh. But thank you for joining us, and have a good short break and a cuppa. Thank you.